Clara Hayes walked into the restaurant with unwashed hair, no makeup, and a sweater 2 sizes too big. She had done it on purpose. The man across the table was looking for someone stable and serious, which meant he wanted a woman who had her life together, and Clara had spent 3 minutes making sure she looked like she didn't. Her plan was simple. Look, terrible, survive dinner, go home alone. But when Julian Carter looked up and saw her, he didn't flinch. He smiled like she was exactly what he'd been waiting to see. The restaurant Julian had chosen was the kind of place Clara would have loved 3 years ago. Warm lighting, brick walls, the smell of wood smoke and old timber. The kind of place where architects noticed the ceiling joists and the original transom windows above the door. She noticed all of it. She just made sure her face said she didn't. She dropped into the chair across from him before he could stand to greet her, which was deliberate. She had rehearsed it. No ceremony. No softness. The sweater she wore was oatmeal-colored and enormous, the kind that belonged to a weekend with nowhere to be, and her hair was pulled back in a knot she hadn't bothered to smooth. She had looked in the mirror before leaving her apartment and thought, good enough. Good enough to be forgettable. Julian Carter was already seated when she arrived. He was taller than she expected, she could tell even from across the table, with dark hair and the kind of face that looked like it had been through something and come out the other side still standing. He was dressed simply. No watch she could see, no visible performance. And when she sat down without preamble, he didn't blink. He just nodded like her arrival made perfect sense. "Clara," he said. Not a question. Just confirmation. "That's me," she said flatly and reached for the water glass. She had been on 3 blind dates in the 2 years since everything fell apart. The first man had spent 40 minutes talking about his ex-wife. The second had looked at her across the table with an expression she recognized immediately, the kind that meant he was already revising his expectations downward. The third had checked his phone 7 times before the appetizers arrived. Each of those dinners had ended the same way, a polite goodbye in the cold outside. And then the long walk home, where she felt absolutely nothing, which was exactly what she had been aiming for. Tonight she had planned to aim lower. If she came in looking like someone who had already given up, the work would be done for her. What she had not planned for was Julian Carter looking at her like she was the most interesting thing in the room. He didn't compliment her. He didn't make small talk about the weather or ask where she was from. He looked at the menu for a moment, set it down, and said, "The friend who set this up told me you're an architect. What do you actually build?" Clara had expected the standard opener. Career as icebreaker resume swap disguised as conversation. She had a version of herself ready for it. Clipped answers, minimal detail, the professional summary that revealed nothing personal. But the way he asked it wasn't polished. It was direct, almost blunt, like he genuinely wanted to know and had no interest in performing curiosity he didn't feel. "Right now, nothing," she said. "I'm doing preservation work, older buildings, mostly buildings that other firms have already written off." Julian leaned back slightly, not in disengagement, but in the way a person does when they're actually thinking about what you said instead of waiting for their turn to speak. Written off meaning what's structurally unsound or just not profitable, both usually, but mostly the second. Clara set her own menu down. A building can be in perfect structural shape and still get demolished because someone ran the numbers and decided a glass tower makes more sense on the same lot. The history doesn't factor into the math. "And you factor it in," he said. "I try to." She caught herself that answer had been honest. She had meant to give him something blander. She reached for her water again, recalibrating. But Julian wasn't done. He asked about the last project she'd worked on, and without quite meaning to, Clara found herself describing a 1920s library branch in the East Village that had been gutted and left empty for 11 years. Its original terrazzo floors still intact under a layer of plywood that a previous tenant had nailed down and abandoned. She told him how she had spent 2 weeks just documenting the building before touching anything, photographing every inch of plaster, mapping every crack, trying to understand what the original architect had intended before she decided what to keep and what to let go. Julian listened with the kind of attention that didn't feel performed. He didn't interrupt. He didn't redirect toward himself. He just listened, and when she finished, he said, "That sounds like the opposite of most people's instinct. Most people assume the new thing is automatically better." "Most people are wrong about that," Clara said. He smiled. Not a polished smile, a real one, the kind that reached the corners of his eyes and made him look briefly younger than he was. And Clara felt something shift in her chest that she immediately distrusted. She had been doing so well. The woman Clara had been before was someone she thought about less now, but not never. She had been someone who stayed late at the office, not because she had to, but because she wanted to, because the work was good, and the work mattered, and she was building something that felt like a future. She had been someone with an actual skincare routine and a standing Sunday brunch reservation, and a fiancé who wore his ambition like a cologne and told her she was the best thing that had happened to him, right up until she found out she wasn't the only thing. Marcus had been her colleague first, then her partner, then the man who leveraged their shared project files to impress a client. She had spent 14 months cultivating a client who then offered him a position at the firm where they both worked, which created a conflict of interest that the senior partners resolved by asking Clara to step down. The official language had been graceful and procedural. The outcome had been complete. She lost the job. She lost the engagement. She lost the version of herself that had believed working harder and caring more was always enough. For a while after she told herself she was fine, she sublet a smaller apartment in Brooklyn. She freelanced. She took the preservation work because nobody else wanted it, and because caring about dying buildings felt more manageable than caring about anything that could choose to leave. She stopped wearing the things she used to wear. She stopped returning calls that felt like effort. She built a life that was narrow enough to be safe, and she told herself, narrow was the same as stable. The blind date had been her friend Dana's idea. Dana had worn Clara down over 4 weeks of persistent, affectionate pestering, not because she believed Clara was ready, but because she believed Clara would never decide she was ready on her own. Clara had agreed mostly to end the conversation, and then spent the week before the date planning exactly how to make it fail. And now she was sitting across from a man who had not once checked his phone, who had asked real questions and waited for real answers, and who had just made her say something she actually believed out loud. She looked down at her plate. The food had arrived at some point without her noticing. "You went quiet," Julian said, not with concern, just observation. "I was thinking about the library," Clara said, which was only half true. They ate. Julian talked not about himself the way she had expected a man of his apparent confidence to talk, but about things, about cities, about the way Manhattan kept building over its own history until the history became invisible. He mentioned once that he traveled often for work, then didn't elaborate on the work itself. He said he had grown up in Chicago, which explained something about the directness, though she couldn't have said exactly what. He was careful with details about his personal life, in a way Clara recognized, because she did the same thing, giving the shape of information without the substance, the outline without the center. She noticed it. She filed it away. She did not ask. When the check came, Julian picked it up without making it an occasion which Clara appreciated. She offered once not as performance, but as reflex, and he shook his head. Once also not as performance. They put on their coats in the entryway, and Clara braced for the part she had been waiting for all evening, the polite deflation that we should do this again. That meant nothing. The slow release of whatever approximation of warmth had built up over the previous 2 hours. Instead, Julian held the door open and said, "I'd like to see you again. Not as a follow-up to this, just again." Clara stepped out onto the sidewalk. The October air was cold and direct, and the street noise came back all at once after the muffled quiet of the restaurant. She looked at him. In the light outside without the warmth of the interior, he looked exactly as straightforward as he had sounded all evening, not performing sincerity, just delivering it. "I don't really do this," she said. "Do what?" She gestured vaguely at the space between them. "This." Julian nodded like that was a reasonable thing to say. "Neither do I usually." He didn't push. He didn't list reasons she should reconsider. He just stood there, hands in his jacket pockets, and waited. Clara thought about her apartment, about the half-finished site report on her desk, and the cold radiator she'd been meaning to call the super about for 3 weeks, and the book she was halfway through, and the way her Saturday mornings had started to feel like rooms with no windows. She thought about the laugh that had come out of her at dinner, the real one surprised out of her, somewhere between the terrazzo floor story and his comment about cities that eat themselves. She had not expected to laugh. She had not planned for it. "One more dinner," she said. "That's not a commitment to anything." "Understood," Julian said. She walked to the subway. She did not look back. But somewhere below the discipline she had spent 2 years building something, had already moved some small and stubborn thing that had survived, in spite of everything she'd done to make it stop mattering. She didn't name it. She wasn't ready to name it. But it was there, and she felt it, and she told herself it was just one more dinner. The second dinner happened on a Thursday. Then there was a walk through the Brooklyn Botanic Garden on a Saturday afternoon that neither of them had planned to be long, but became long anyway, because the conversation kept finding new directions, and neither of them was in a hurry to end it. Julian asked her once what had made her leave the firm she'd been at, and Clara gave him the abbreviated version, creative differences, a restructuring, and he accepted it without pressing, which was both a relief and in a way she didn't examine a small disappointment. She found herself wanting him to press. She found herself wanting to tell him the full version which was unlike her, which was alarming. Instead, she told him about a warehouse in Red Hook she'd been hired to assess a former textile factory built in the 1890s that still had the original wood-beam ceilings and cast-iron columns, and how she had found a partial set of the original blueprints folded inside the wall cavity during demolition prep, and how holding those papers, over 130 years old, had felt like being handed something no one had meant to save. Julian had stopped walking when she described it. He stood in the middle of the garden path, looking at her, with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not pity, not admiration, something more careful than either. "You love it," he said. "Not the buildings, the finding." Clara considered that. "Yes," she said, because it was true. The finding. She looked at him, looking at her, and for the first time in 2 years, she felt not invisible, but entirely seen, and not in the way that used to frighten her, not like being exposed, but like being accurately known. It was disorienting in a way that had nothing to do with fear. She told herself it was just the season. October light did strange things to a person's judgment. She told herself she would be more careful next time. That evening, she walked home along the water and did not turn on the television, and sat for a long time in the kitchen with a cup of tea going cold in her hands, thinking about nothing specific and everything at once. She had agreed to see him again on Tuesday. She did not cancel. November arrived the way it always did in New York, without permission. The trees along Prospect Park dropped their last leaves in a single week, and the light went flat and gray, and Clara found herself checking her phone more than she used to, which she noticed and disliked and did not stop doing. She and Julian had settled into something that didn't have a name yet. They met twice a week, sometimes 3 times. They walked. They ate. They talked about cities and buildings and the particular kind of grief that comes from watching something old get torn down to make room for something that will look dated in 15 years. She had stopped rehearsing what to say before she saw him. She had stopped planning exits. These were not small things, but there was a shape to Julian that she couldn't quite get to the center of, and she was starting to feel it. When she talked about work, she talked about specific projects: the Red Hook warehouse, a Harlem brownstone with a collapsed rear facade, a mid-century bank building in the Bronx, whose terrazzo floors were worth more than the developers had realized when they signed the demolition permit. She gave him the details because the details were the point. Julian listened to all of it with genuine attention, but when the conversation turned toward him, something changed. He would talk around things. He traveled often, but never said where. He worked in investment and development, but never named a company. When she asked once what kind of projects he focused on, he said infrastructure and long-term assets, and then redirected the conversation so smoothly she didn't realize it had happened until she was already 3 sentences into talking about something else. It wasn't evasiveness exactly. It was more like the way someone moves around a piece of furniture they've learned to navigate in the dark, practiced automatic invisible, until you notice the pattern. Clara noticed the pattern. She was an architect. She understood structures by reading what wasn't there as much as what was. She told herself it didn't matter. People were private. She was private. The deal she had made with herself when she agreed to see him again was that she wasn't going to need things from this. She wasn't going to build expectations and then blame him when he couldn't hold them. She would take what the thing was and not push it into a shape it hadn't chosen. She kept that deal with herself for about 3 weeks. Then she made the mistake of falling in love with him, and the deal became impossible to honor. She didn't recognize it as love at first. It came in sideways, the way things do when you've spent 2 years making yourself resistant. It was in the way she would think of something during the day and immediately want to tell him. It was in the way his voice had become familiar enough that silence felt like the wrong frequency when he wasn't there. It was in the way she had started, without consciously deciding to pulling her hair out of the knot occasionally, before she met him, not putting on makeup, not performing anything, just less deliberately undone than before. It was a small thing. She noticed it with something close to alarm, and then she found out who he was. It happened the way most things she hadn't prepared for happened accidentally in an ordinary moment. She was waiting for Julian at a coffee shop on a Wednesday morning laptop, open scrolling through a trade journal article about adaptive reuse financing, and the name Carter Holdings appeared in the 3rd paragraph as one of the 3 largest private investors in a new historic preservation incentive program she hadn't heard of. She followed the link at the bottom of the article out of professional reflex, and the page it took her to was a profile of the fund. There was a photo. The man in the photo was standing in front of a glass building in what looked like Midtown, wearing a suit she had never seen him in, and the caption below it read, "Julian Carter, Chief Executive Officer, Carter Holdings." Clara read the caption twice, then she read the article. Carter Holdings had assets under management valued at several $billion. The firm had holdings in more than 14 countries. Julian had founded it 11 years ago after leaving a private equity position, had expanded it through a series of acquisitions that the financial press called, in the language financial press, used aggressive and precise. There was a quote from Forbes she found it in a linked piece from 2 years prior that described him as one of the most influential private investors in American real estate and infrastructure. The article used the word billionaire without hesitation. Clara closed the laptop. She sat in the coffee shop for 6 minutes, looking at nothing, and then Julian came through the door, saw her from across the room, and smiled the same way. He always smiled like something uncomplicated, like something true, and she felt the full weight of what she had just learned land on her chest like a structural failure she had not seen coming. She didn't say anything at first. They ordered, they sat, and she watched him pour sugar into his coffee with the same absent ease he always had. And she thought he knew exactly who he was every time he sat across from her and said nothing. "Carter Holdings," she said, Julian set the spoon down. He didn't pretend not to understand. He just looked at her with an expression that was already somewhere past surprise, like he had always known this moment was coming and had not figured out how to prevent it. "Yes," he said. "You're the CEO." She kept her voice flat. It was not difficult. She had had practice. "I am," Julian said. "I should have told you earlier. I know that." Clara looked at her coffee. The simple explanation was the obvious one. She should be flattered or reassured or something. Here was a man who had sat across from her in her worst sweater and her unwashed hair and had not flinched. Here was a man who had chosen her specifically before she knew there was a choice being made. There was a version of this story that was almost romantic. She understood the version. She also understood that she had spent an entire month talking to him without knowing who she was talking to. She had said real things. She had let him see inside the work she cared about, inside the thinking. She almost never showed anyone inside the part of herself she had spent 2 years covering up, because the last man who had seen it had handed it over to a client to advance his own career. She had opened slowly and carefully, the way a building is unsealed when you don't yet know what's inside, and the whole time Julian had been standing there, holding information he had chosen to withhold. "You were testing me," she said. It wasn't quite a question. Julian shook his head. "I wasn't. That's not what it was." He kept his hands on the table and didn't reach for her, which she respected and hated in equal measure. "I was tired of people knowing that first, before they knew anything else, before they knew what I thought about anything or what I found worth paying attention to, or whether I was worth spending an evening with." Every relationship I'd been in for the past 5 years had started with the same dynamic, and I knew the dynamic was wrong, and I didn't know how to fix it, except to remove the information that caused it. "So you lied," Clara said. "I withheld," he said. "I know that's not better." Clara looked at him. He looked back, and she thought about the month they had spent together, the real questions he had asked, the real listening he had done, the way she had talked about finding those blueprints inside the wall of the Red Hook warehouse, and he had stopped walking to look at her because she had said something true. None of that had been false. She knew it hadn't been false. That was exactly the problem. She picked up her coffee, stood up, and put on her coat. "I need some time," she said, and walked out. She did not answer his calls for 10 days. She told herself she was protecting herself, which was true. She also told herself she was angry, which was true. She told herself his deception was unforgivable, which was the part she couldn't make stick. Because the more she turned it over, the more she kept arriving at the same uncomfortable place, a place where she was not entirely on solid ground herself. Clara had shown up to the first dinner, looking the way she had looked on purpose. She had built the whole evening around a performance of being someone who didn't care, who wasn't trying, who couldn't be hurt, because there was nothing to hurt. She had worn the oversized sweater and the unwashed hair, not because she was running late and hadn't had time to prepare, but because she had calculated that if she looked bad enough, Julian would remove himself from her life with minimal friction, and she could go home intact. She had manufactured a version of herself specifically designed to make sure no one would want her. Julian had hidden his wealth so that someone might want him for reasons that had nothing to do with it. She had hidden her actual self so that no one could get close enough to find reasons to leave. The methods were different. The fear underneath them was the same. Both of them had walked into that restaurant wearing armor they'd had years to build. Both of them had been pretending to be less than they were. She sat with that for a long time. She sat with it through the end of November and into December. Through the mornings, she didn't reach for her phone, and the evenings, when she stood in her kitchen making dinner for one, and could not stop thinking about what he had said. I was tired of people knowing that first, before they knew anything else. She understood that. She understood it in a way that made the anger harder to hold, But understanding something and being ready to do something about it were two different problems, and Clara was not yet ready. The library project came through in early December, the East Village branch she had spent the better part of a year fighting for. The city's preservation board approved the full restoration plan, which meant real funding, real timelines, and a public opening in 3 weeks that the local press had already picked up as a human interest angle, the forgotten 1920s library reclaimed. Clara threw herself into the final push with the particular focus she always used to crowd out things she wasn't ready to think about. She supervised every detail of the finishing work herself, the repointing of the exterior limestone, the restoration of the original oak reading tables that had been found in storage, the careful cleaning of the terrazzo floors she had discovered under the plywood more than a year ago. She did not contact Julian, but she did without entirely meaning to think about him every time she walked through those doors. He was the only person outside of work she had told about this building. He was the only one who had asked the right question, not what she was building, but what she was finding. 3 days before the opening, Julian sent her a message. It was 4 sentences long. He said he understood if she didn't want to continue. He said he wasn't going to argue for something she didn't want. He said he had meant every conversation which she already knew and wished she didn't. And then he said that if she needed him to stay away from the opening, so she didn't have to navigate his presence on a night that was hers, he would do that. She read the message 3 times and did not reply. The night of the opening was cold and clear. The library filled with people, neighbors, city officials, local journalists, the kind of community crowd that showed up when something they had given up on turned out to have survived. Clara stood near the back and watched them move through the space, watched the way they stopped when they saw the terrazzo floors, watched the particular expression people get when they encounter something that is genuinely old and genuinely beautiful and had been there all along beneath everything ordinary that had covered it. She had spent a year on this room. She knew every square foot of it, and standing in it on the night it was finally open, she felt a hollowness that had nothing to do with the building. Julian was not there. He had kept his word, which was more than she had asked him for. She thought about what he had said in the coffee shop. Every relationship for the past 5 years had started with the same dynamic. She thought about her own last 5 years, the deliberate withdrawal, the self-erasure, the way she had trained herself to make nothing matter, so nothing could hurt. She thought about showing up to dinner, looking like someone who had already surrendered. She thought about how she had stood in her mirror that night and thought good enough to be forgettable, and how that had been the goal. How forgettable had been the thing she was aiming for. The fear hadn't kept her safe. It had kept her alone. And alone, she had just opened the most important project of her career in a room full of people. And the loneliness of it was the only thing she could feel. That was the moment she understood, not abstractly, but fully in her body, that she had already lost something she had never properly held. And that the reason she had never properly held it was the same reason Julian had hidden his name, because being known is the one thing that cannot be undone. And they had both been too frightened to risk it. She stayed until the last guests left. She turned off the lights herself. She locked the door. She stood on the sidewalk outside in the cold for a long time, looking up at the restored limestone facade with its original lettering still intact above the entrance. And she thought, I would not have found what was inside this building if I hadn't been willing to open it. She took out her phone. She didn't call. Calling felt like the wrong format for what she needed to say. Too easy to hang up. Too easy to reduce to something that could be ended with a single word from either direction. She texted instead 3 words, "Can we meet?" and then stood on the sidewalk outside the library with her phone in her hand, watching the screen, feeling the cold move through her coat. His reply came in under 2 minutes. He gave her an address in the West Village and a time the following morning. Nothing else. No question about whether she was okay. No pressure, no performance of relief. Just the information she needed. She put her phone away and walked to the subway, and did not let herself rehearse what she was going to say, because every time she had rehearsed things in the past 2 years, what came out of her mouth had been a cleaned-up version of the truth, and she was done with cleaned-up versions. The address was a building she hadn't expected. Not a glass tower, not a corporate lobby with a doorman in a uniform. It was a renovated brownstone on a narrow street, 4 stories of original 19th century brick, with new steel-framed windows that had been installed carefully enough to respect the original facade proportions. Clara stood outside it for a moment, before pressing the buzzer, because she was an architect, and she could not help but read the building, and what it said was that whoever lived here had thought about what they were doing to it. That whoever was inside understood that the bones of a thing mattered. Julian opened the door himself. He was in a gray shirt and dark trousers, no jacket, no performance. He looked like a man who had not slept particularly well, but was not going to mention it. He stepped back to let her in, and she walked past him into a foyer with original plaster medallions on the ceiling and a staircase with iron balusters that had been stripped and repainted sometime in the last decade, and she thought, of course, this is where he lives. I looked up the building, she said, before she lost the thread of what she was doing here. 1883. It was a single-family residence until the 1940s, then split into apartments, then vacant for 6 years, before whoever bought it restored it. I bought it, Julian said, 12 years ago. It took 3 years to get it back to what it should have been. Clara turned to look at him. That was the longest he had ever voluntarily said about anything he owned. He was watching her with the same careful attention he had always had, the kind that didn't push but didn't retreat either. And she thought, this is the whole problem and the whole point. He had always been exactly this. She had just been too defended to let it mean anything. I have things I need to say, she told him, and I need you to not respond until I'm finished, because if you say something in the middle, I'll lose my nerve, and we'll end up having a different conversation. Okay, Julian said. She had not rehearsed this. She stood in his foyer with her coat still on, and said what was true. She said that she had not been honest with him either, not in the way he had been dishonest, not by withholding a fact that would have changed how he saw her, but by spending the entire first month of knowing him performing a version of herself that was deliberately diminished. She told him about the sweater, about the unwashed hair, about the mirror in her apartment, the night of the first dinner, and the word she had used, forgettable. She said she had engineered her own forgettability because she had decided that if someone rejected her worst version, it would hurt less than if they rejected something real. That she had been doing that in one form or another for 2 years. That it had worked in the sense that she had not been hurt and had also not been alive in any way that felt worth protecting. She told him that she understood why he had hidden his name. Not because it was the right choice, it wasn't, and they both knew it, but because she understood the architecture of it. The way fear builds structures that look like strategy. The way a person can be completely sincere about everything except the one thing that would make sincerity matter. I was angry at you, she said, because you did to me exactly what I was doing to you. And it's a lot easier to be angry at someone else for a thing than to look at why you recognize it so well. Julian had been quiet through all of it, the way he was quiet, not passive, not withholding, but genuinely absorbing what she was saying. When she finished, he didn't move toward her immediately. He put his hands in his pockets and looked at her for a moment and said, I should have told you before you had to find out from a trade publication. Yes, Clara said. You should have. I know the difference between protecting myself and deceiving someone, Julian said. I knew it when I was doing it. I just thought the risk of telling you was bigger than the cost of waiting. I was wrong about that. You were, Clara said. He nodded. He looked like a man who had already had this conversation with himself many times over the past weeks, and arrived at the same conclusion each time, and was relieved in some fundamental way to be having it out loud. "I don't want to do it again," he said. "Any of it. I don't want to manage what you know about me. I don't want to be known in pieces." Clara unzipped her coat and draped it over the newel post at the bottom of the staircase, the way you do in a place where you have decided to stay for a while. "Then don't," she said. They sat in his kitchen, an original room, with exposed brick on the north wall, and ceiling beams that Clara estimated, dated to the initial construction, left exposed during the renovation, with the kind of restraint that meant whoever made the decision had understood what they had. Julian made coffee. He told her about Carter Holdings, not the Forbes version, not the press release version, but the actual version, the one that started with a failed deal in his late 20s that cost him 2 years of work and nearly everything he'd saved, and how he had rebuilt from it, with the specific understanding that he never again wanted to be in a position where other people's assumptions about him were more powerful than the facts. He had built the company around long-term assets, infrastructure, historic real estate land, because those were things that held their value when everything else moved. He had gotten very good at identifying what was worth saving. "That's what you do too," he said. "You just do it with buildings." Clara wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "I do it with buildings because buildings don't leave," she said, and then heard herself say it, and laughed a short, dry sound, because it was the truest and most embarrassing thing she had said in recent memory. Julian didn't laugh. He looked at her with the careful, accurate expression she had seen on the first night, and every time since the one that meant he was actually registering what she had said. And he nodded once like the information mattered. They talked for 3 hours. Not about what they were going to do, not about what this meant or where it was going. They had both spent enough time calculating futures to know it was the wrong way to spend the morning. They talked about the real things, the ones that had always been underneath the conversations they'd had before. He told her about his marriage briefly, and without drama. A woman named Rachel. A good marriage, a fast illness, a loss that had restructured everything about how he understood time. Clara told him about Marcus, the full version, not the abbreviated one she had given him in the Botanic Garden. The project files, the client, the senior partners, and their graceful procedural language, the specific feeling of having your own care for something weaponized against you. She told him about the day she had sat in her empty office after being asked to step down and thought, if I make myself matter less, nothing like this can happen again. How that had seemed at the time like wisdom. Julian listened to all of it. When she finished, he said, "You didn't make yourself matter less. You just made yourself less visible. You still cared about everything. You were just doing it where no one could reach it." Clara looked at him. It was a precise thing to say. It was also completely accurate, and the accuracy of it landed somewhere deep in the part of her that had been telling itself for 2 years that diminishment was the same as healing. It wasn't. She knew it wasn't. She had just needed someone who paid enough attention to say it in a way she couldn't argue with. The Community Preservation Fund was Julian's idea, and it came up naturally the way things do when 2 people are finally talking without the filters they spent years constructing. He had been looking at ways to deploy capital into preservation work that wouldn't otherwise get funded. Not the landmark projects that attracted institutional donors, but the smaller ones, the neighborhood buildings that were architecturally significant in ways that didn't show up in city designation databases. The 1890s textile factory in Red Hook, the mid-century bank in the Bronx, the buildings that Clara had been working on one at a time with freelance budgets and institutional indifference. He said he had been thinking about it for months, that the historic preservation incentive program he'd invested in through Carter Holdings was a starting point. But what was missing was someone who understood which buildings mattered, and why someone who could read a structure and tell you what was actually inside it. "I know someone like that," Clara said. Julian looked at her steadily. "I know you do," he said. "That's why I'm telling you." They did not make it neat. That was the thing Clara understood in the weeks that followed, as they rebuilt what they had on a foundation that had no hidden rooms in it. It was not seamless. There were conversations that were uncomfortable about money, about the gap between his world and hers, about what it meant to take something from someone you were in love with, and whether it changed the shape of what you were building together. Clara had spent 2 years being self-sufficient in the particular ferocious way of someone who cannot afford to need anything, and the process of letting that go was not clean or fast. Julian had his own version of the same problem, the practiced self-containment, the reflex to manage instead of share the instinct to protect his real life by keeping it behind the version of himself he showed the world. They kept making the same mistake in different forms. They kept catching themselves doing it and saying so out loud. That was the part that was new, the saying so out loud, the willingness to be found mid-mistake, instead of waiting until they had already corrected it and presenting the corrected version. It was uncomfortable in the way that things are uncomfortable when they are also correct. The fund came together over the winter. Clara brought the Red Hook warehouse project in first, then the Bronx bank building, then a row of connected 1920s storefronts in Jackson Heights that a developer had been trying to rezone for 4 years. Julian handled the financial structure and left every architectural decision entirely to her, which was not a small thing. It required him to trust her judgment in a domain where he had real knowledge and real opinions, and he did it without performing restraint. He genuinely stepped back. She noticed it and did not take it for granted. By the time spring arrived, the fund had its first 3 projects under contract, and a name the Foundational Trust. Clara had suggested something more official sounding. Julian had said the simpler the name, the longer it lasts, and he was right. And she told him so. They got married on a Saturday in April in the restored reading room of the East Village Library, because it was the only space that made sense. The terrazzo floors caught the morning light, the way terrazzo always does, practically and beautifully without trying. There was no wedding party, no formal reception line, no architecture of ceremony designed to impress people who were already there. Just their friends, the room, and the 2 of them standing in the middle of something that had been worth saving. Clara wore a dress she had chosen because she liked it. Clean lines the color of old linen, the kind of thing she would have worn 3 years ago before she decided that wanting to be seen was the same as asking to be hurt. Her hair was down. She had put on exactly as much as she wanted and nothing additional. Standing at the front of the room while the people she loved filled the chairs behind her, she did not feel exposed the way she had spent 2 years dreading. She felt, for the first time in longer than she could accurately measure like herself, not a reduced version, not a defended one. Just Clara standing in a building she had helped restore next to a man who had first looked at her in a terrible sweater with unwashed hair and thought, there she is. Julian took her hand when she reached him, and she let him, and that was the whole of it, the simplest version of what they had spent months working toward. Not the money, not the fund, not the brownstone with its restored iron balusters and 19th century brick, not the Forbes profile or the public opening or the architectural press that had picked up the library story and run it under a headline about reclaiming what gets left behind. None of that was the point. The point was that Julian Carter had walked into a blind date looking for something real and found a woman who was trying so hard not to be found. And Clara Hayes had walked into the same room trying to be forgettable and had been seen clearly and accurately by the one person she had not prepared herself for. 2 people who had used different kinds of armor to protect themselves from the same fear, that if someone saw all of them, really, all of them, it would not be enough. It turned out the armor was the problem. It turned out that what they were afraid of being seen was exactly the part worth seeing. She had spent a year restoring a building that everyone had given up on. She had pulled back the plywood and found the terrazzo floor still intact, underneath exactly what they had always been waiting for someone willing to look. She understood, standing in that room on that morning, that people were not so different from the structures they built, layered over time, sometimes damaged, sometimes left empty for years, in ways that looked like loss. But not beyond restoration. Never, if you were willing to do the work beyond restoration.